So we're continuing our series called Reset, and I'm continuing to lean heavily on Dallas Willard's material. And if you remember, to reset a phone is to restore it to the manufacturer's original setting. And we're living in the middle of Jesus doing a huge reset, if you like, the Creator's reset to his original settings for his church, restoring the church all across the world to his original intention and design. And that is an amazing time to be alive, that God is bringing his church back to what he always intended it to be. Now, in our journey so far, what we've seen is that Jesus has had to overcome our familiarity with Christianity, that actually was a barrier to him, because that familiarity, actually it bred a degree of unfamiliarity. Jesus has also had to overcome our lack of understanding of what the good news, what the gospel is. It's not merely forgiveness of sins. It's not merely assurance of heaven. It's not merely believing the right things. It's about the fullness of life available right now. And he's had to overcome a culture that's reduced followership to believing the right things about Jesus, if you like, mere mental assent, without any expectation that we would actually begin to live like him. And we've seen that he's had to overcome the kind of what would Jesus do mentality of trying to be holy on the basis of trying to be holy as the basis for our change. And today what we want to do is unpack more actually how Jesus does change lives. Because one of the things we've begun to understand is how Jesus changes lives. Our mission statement, which has always been the mission statement of our church, was introducing and is introducing people to the life-changing power of God's truth and his love. And it speaks about God's power to change lives. And changed lives has always been, it was and is our measure of success. Not how big the church is, but how lives are changing. And actually, we thought we knew how Jesus changed lives. Read the Bible, pray, join a growth group, tithe, attend on Sunday, serve. And by doing those things, people would change. Basically, if you do the right things, you will change. But although we were sincere, worked hard at following Jesus, and tried really hard to be holy and not to sin, we really weren't changing that deeply. Let me just speak for myself. Despite all the trying, I was still the kind of person who was impatient in traffic. I was still the kind of person who is kind to people who are kind to me, but to those who are unkind to me, I can give as good as I get. I would lose the head with the kids at home if they weren't doing something the way I thought it should be done. And I could just be in bad humour and unkind for no reason to Debbie, for no real reason. So on the surface, I was nice. And usually I was really nice. But if things didn't go my way, or if there were stresses in life, I could be unkind, mean, hurtful, especially to those closest to me, those I lived with. I really wasn't much different from my neighbour who didn't know Jesus. And really, I didn't look like someone who's being transformed into the kind of person who had Jesus' life and power, empowering them. But I was trying. I would have got an A for effort. At one stage, I was fasting 2 full days a week, 1 full week a year, trying to be holy. But even then, when I fast, I get really hungry, obviously. And when I get hungry, I get in bad humour, and I take it out on the people I live with. I was trying so hard to be good and nice and a well done, good and faithful servant kind of person. But it was as if that goodness wasn't in me. Now, remember last week we looked at how trying to be holy, to be good, is not the way God has given us to be changed or transformed into the kind of people whose lives look like the kind of life that Jesus would live if he were them. Instead, if it's not trying what it is, what we need to do, and we gave a hint of it last week, is we need to train, actually to be fully trained. And that's the framework, that's the worldview, if you like, that Jesus has for us. In Luke 6:4, Jesus says, the student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. The student, he's talking about us, is not above the teacher, he's talking about him, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. So what I want to do is have us think about training, that idea, not just actually in the Christian life, but in all aspects of life. So we're thinking about training. My neighbour, Paul, he runs marathons. It's not like he ran a marathon once in his life. He will run 5 or 6 marathons every year. The only time I see him almost is when he's out running on the roads, training for the next marathon. It's like he's just always out training. For hours at a time, in all weathers, he's like a running machine. A word you would use for Paul is he is intentional. He's very intentional when it comes to training for marathons. And one day I was talking to him, and he told me he was off to Berlin that weekend to run in the Berlin Marathon. And I was surprised that he'd fly somewhere to run in a marathon. But he said actually there's 2 or 3 plane loads of people leave Dublin every year to run in the Berlin Marathon. Now, suppose I said to Paul, hey Paul, I'm free this weekend. I'll fly over as well and I'll run the marathon with you. So I go to Berlin with Paul, I line up with him and off we go. What do you think would happen? Paul will finish the marathon and I wouldn't. I couldn't. Now I'd be really determined because I'm a kind of a determined kind of person, and I'd probably keep going when I should stop, and I might end up in hospital. And if I did end up in hospital, no one would be surprised. A 60-year-old man who hasn't trained for a marathon and then tries to run the marathon on the spur of the moment, everyone knows he'd fail. He's actually being stupid. Could get a heart attack or a stroke or something. You see, that 60-year-old man, I hadn't been doing the kinds of things, the training, the running on the roads, the building up distances over the year, making sure I had the right diet, having the right type of running shoes. I hadn't been doing all those kinds of things that would enable me to successfully finish the marathon, even if I tried really hard on the day. And you see, the point is, you can't successfully run a marathon on the spur of a moment. You can't successfully run the marathon on the spur of the moment. Just trying to decide one morning, hey, I'm going to run a marathon, and then run it that afternoon, it can't happen. It takes a long period of training. So, if I want to run a marathon, I would have to adopt the lifestyle of Paul, my neighbour, who's a marathon runner. I'd have to do the daily training, the long hours running around the streets of Dublin, building up my distances, 10k and then 20k, building up to a full marathon, which is like 26 miles or 42k. It'd be foolish to think that I could run the marathon without doing that. And it would be a mistake. No one can run a marathon on the spur of the moment. Now, getting back to Jesus. We want to live like Jesus. Live the kind of life Jesus would live if he were living my life. That's a life characterized by kindness and gentleness and compassion for others, of patience with others, of inner peace, beyond understanding, of a joy in all circumstances. That we actually become that kind of person, the kind of person who even loves enemies. But the thing is, you see, we can't become that kind of person on the spur of the moment. So that in the middle of traffic, just in that moment when someone cuts in front of you, you can't become a patient person in that moment. Or if you've had a long, hard week at work and you're tired and you're stressed and you arrive home in bad humour, you can't in that moment be kind and thoughtful and patient with the people you live with. You can't be like Jesus in that moment. And the great mistake we make is to think that we can become like Jesus in the moment when we need it. Like think, well, what would Jesus do in this moment, and then do that? While in the rest of our lives, we live just like everyone else. You see, we can't become like Jesus without adopting the lifestyle of Jesus. We can't become a marathon runner without adopting the lifestyle of training that a marathon runner follows. You and me, we can't become the kind of person Jesus wants to make us into be without adopting the lifestyle of Jesus. We can't become the kind of person Jesus was without adopting the lifestyle of Jesus. So what did Jesus' lifestyle look like? In Luke 5:16 it says, Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. So Jesus is often in times of silence and solitude. He fasts. We see him memorizing scripture. We see, he says he came to serve. In John 13, we see him actually washing disciples' feet. These are the lifestyle things that Jesus had. He attends synagogue, like a church service, as was his custom. Not just to teach, but to attend. Luke 4:16. He was often within a small group of disciples, like what we might call a growth group. Prayer. Now, later in the series, we will look at these. And we see these same lifestyle practices in the early church. So this was the lifestyle of Jesus. But I want today just to continue on the idea of training and what the early leaders did and what they taught others to do. So this is Paul writing to, if you like, his young apprentice, Timothy. And he says in 1 Timothy 4:7-8, he says, Timothy, have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. Rather, train, and the word for training is the Greek word that we get gymnasium from. Gym, he says, train yourself to be godly. For physical training, again the word gym, is of some value, but godliness has value for all things. So what Paul is telling Timothy, he's not saying now, try really hard to be good and godly, but to train, the word gym, himself to be godly. In other words, kind, patient, gentle, generous. And in Greece in those times, there was huge sports games every year. The Olympics, every year there was sports games. The Olympics, what we call the Olympics, was one of 4 different types of games each year. So a runner in training, or seeing an athlete in training, that would have been a really understandable image for Timothy. So Paul is telling Timothy, just like physical training has value for the runners in the games, in the Olympic Games, you train yourself to be godly, kind, generous, patient, gentle, to be the kind of person that Jesus would be if he was living your life. Train. Training has real value if you want to become the kind of person who is godly. You can train yourself to be like Jesus with the Spirit's help. Now, Paul wrote that letter to Timothy at the end of Paul's life. 10 years earlier, he writes to the church in Corinth. And Corinth was a major city at the time, and it had its own games called the Isthmian Games, again it was one of those major 4 games. So again, the guys in Corinth would be really familiar with people competing and training in competitions, different types of athletic competitions, and they'd know about all the training involved. And Paul is writing this to the Corinthians. This is in 1 Corinthians 9:24-27. So he says, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. So then you have to ask, well, what does it look like to run in such a way to get a prize? So Paul goes on and he says, everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. So what running in such a way to get the prize looks like isn't so much attending to the individual race itself, but it looks like the strict training before you do the race. So preparing for the race is so important, this strict training. And why train? They train to get a crown, the runners, that will not last. But we train, Paul says, to get a crown that will last forever. So runners who want to win train. They're doing it for fame, but we do it for a crown that will last forever. And then Paul goes on and explain how he lives. So he's just told the Corinthians, train, go into strict training to be godly. Then he talks about his own training and how he trains. But before we look at that, I just want to talk about people who go to the gym today. I used to be in a gym. And there's some people who go to the gym. They go like maybe for 2 hours, 3 or 4 days a week. They have all the right gear. And when they go to gym, they try a little bit of that machine and a little bit of this machine. They spend half an hour trying to get the right podcast to listen to. And then they're talking to their friends, and then they're finished until the next day. They might not have even broken a sweat. They're in the gym, but they're not. Then there's other guys. They spend the same amount of time at the gym, 2 hours, 3 or 4 days a week. They don't talk to anyone. They have a set program. They do arms one day, legs the next, abs the next, and they push themselves hard. They try and lift more and more weights, increase their reps. They work on their diet. They with high protein diet to help build muscle. They watch videos to learn how to have the right form when they lift. They subject their body to intense strain. You might even say they're almost beating their body, subjecting their body to extreme discipline. Like you'll hear them groan and yell with just the pressure they're putting their bodies under. All that to get in shape. Now, with the gym in mind, let's read what Paul says. So he'll continue. So Paul says, therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself may not be disqualified from the prize. So in the gym, running aimlessly, Paul says, I don't run aimlessly. It's like the guy who just buzzes around between machines, spends 30 minutes trying to find the right music. That's a bit like a boxer who just trains punching the air. He never hits the punch bag. That's not what Paul does. Paul is rigorous in this training. He puts his mind and his body under intense discipline, making it his slave, just like the serious guys in the gym, because he wants to train himself in a way that he wins the prize, that transforms him into the kind of person that he would be if Jesus were living his life by the power of the Spirit. Training, discipline, that's what a disciple does. Not trying hard to be holy, but training to be. Now, Paul's ministry was about 20 years, maybe less. His letter to the Corinthians was halfway through it. His letter to Timothy was at the end. And the whole time he's consistent. He's telling everyone, enter the training of Jesus. Enter the training of Jesus. Now, you might be saying, Sean, that really sounds like you're wandering away from grace. Because grace tells us that there's nothing we can do or should do to be saved. We just trust in the finished work of Jesus on the cross. And what you're saying, Sean, sounds like a lot of effort. Now, we'll answer that objection next week, but I want to give you one last picture of training. This is Paul, his kind of autobiography of his big view of his training. This is from Philippians chapter 3. He says, I want to know Christ. That's his goal, that's his prize. Yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection of the dead. Not that I've already obtained all this, or I've already arrived at my goal, but I press on to take hold of that for which Christ took hold of me. Brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining, again you get this idea of strict training, strict discipline, forgetting what is behind and straining towards what is ahead, I press on. Again, another effort word, towards the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Jesus Christ. And the prize is Jesus himself. So why all the effort? Why all the training? Because the prize is Jesus and life with him. Imagine being the kind of person who is being inwardly renewed every day, even when the circumstances of life are dire. Imagine becoming a different kind of person. Imagine becoming the kind of person that when you're caught off guard, you're kind. Because you've become that kind of person on the inside. Imagine becoming the kind of person Jesus would be if he were living your life, if you're a mother at home, if you're a student, if you're a shop worker, if you're retired. That's God's vision for your life. It's God's vision for my life. And his power is available to us to enable us to change and move in that direction. Over time, not overnight. Our role, and we do have a role, is to cooperate with God. Cooperate with him in the way that he has ordained to change us. And that is through our training, to use the word gym Paul uses. So, can I leave you with just some things to think about before I pray? You can't do what Jesus did in a particular situation on the spur of the moment. To have the kind of life Jesus had, you must adopt the lifestyle that Jesus had. You must enter into training. So what is one area where you could begin to adopt the lifestyle of Jesus? So let me pray. Lord, there's a lot of words here of strict training, making my body my slave, intense discipline, that it actually sounds more like a gym than it sounds like the Christian life. But that attitude is the attitude Paul had, and the attitude you invite us to have when you say that the disciple who is fully trained will be like his master. Jesus, would you help us to think more deeply about this and begin to make changes in our lives so as that we embrace strict training, because you are the prize. Amen.